world where most of our communications, our linguistic communications now, are mediated rather than live and face-to-face. And we're bombarded and saturated by communications designed to manipulate us in some kind of commercial or social reaction. So, as with the TED Talk format itself, clear, concise, and comprehensible communication is seen as a priority. Tonight, I'd like to talk about a diametrically opposed tradition of poetry, a practice that pushes language to its limits, to a kind of poetry that disrupts and subverts the very idea of clear and comprehensible communication. Today, I want to talk about sound poetry and its variants, both pure sound poetry and nonsense verse that deploys familiar words in a way that doesn't make sense. Sound poetry developed in the early part of the 20th century and was part of avant-garde art performance practice amongst the Dadaists, Futurists, and Constructivists. Perhaps the most famous sound poem, though not the earliest, is Kurt Schwitter's Ur-Sonata, or originary primeval sonata. And he wrote this over 10 years between 1922 and 1932. That's his first performance of it at Dada. And it's kind of like a musical score. So it's words, but it's a musical score. So this is my version, this is my reading of Kurt Schwitter's, a little bit of it, it's really long. Fums bo woo e a po gif. Ooh, 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 d l r r beep bo, d l r beep bo, fum boo, woo e a ooh, po gif, rackety bee bee fumbo, rackety bee bee fumbo. So it's using sound, language, as a kind of music. Schwitter's was influenced by earlier Dada experimentalists in nonsense verse, and he was problematically but loosely associated with the Dadaists. Basically, they excluded him from their group because they thought he was too sentimental and expressionist. Although he had much in common with them, he was a strong proponent of multidisciplinary practices involving collage, visual as well as sound poetry, early installation art and performance, so a man close to my heart. And he was very influenced by the performance of Hugo Ball at Cabaret Voltaire in 1916. And here's a little verse of Hugo Ball's. Gaji beri bimba, glandich lauli form kadori. Another really famous example of sound poetry is the work of the Italian futurist artist Filippo Marinetti. And his most famous work is Zang Tum Tum, which, as we can see, is both visual as well as sound verse. And he uses words as well as sounds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Siege guns split the silence in unison. Tum, tum. Sudden echoes, all the echoes. Sense it, smash it, scatter it to the infinite winds, to the devil. In the middle of these, tum, tum, flattened 30 square kilometers, leap. 2, 6, 8, crashes, clubs, punches, smashes, quick-firing batteries, violence, ferocity, regularity, pendulum, play, fatality. These weights, thicknesses, sound, smell, molecular whirlwinds, chain nets and channels of analogies, concurrences and synchronisms for my futurist friends. Zang tum tum, ta 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 ta, pick pack pack pack, pick pack pack. Zang tum tum tum. Why was it so important in the early years of the 20th century? And why might it be relevant right now? Well, I think this might give you a clue. This is part of the Zang Tum Tum poet. And Marinetti was a journalist as well as a poet. And he wrote Zang Tum Tum when he was reporting from the Battle of Adrianople, or Edirne. So you can see that's supposed to be a Turkish balloon that was used during the First World War. So this poetry emerges at a time of war, of huge technological and social change. It emerges at a time of rapid mechanization, of changes in living conditions brought about by industrialization in the 19th century. And we can celebrate the fruits of that change, but we can also, if we read historians like Engels, like Frederick Engels in Manchester, appreciate how actually it made most people's lives worse for a long, long time. And it was a time of great instability, the collapse of the great pre-industrial empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Tsarist Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The fierce competition for resources and colonies between the two most industrialized nations at the time, Germany and the United Kingdom, led to war. The logic of capitalism led not only to political instability that was to last, if we think about it, until, for the whole of the first half of the 20th century, and caused 2 world wars. It was an ideology that presented these changes as inevitable, logical, sensible. The avant-garde art movements across Europe and the newly born USSR celebrated modernity and the machine age too. But unlike the top-down political discourses of Marxism, fascism, and liberalism, which tried to make sense of the chaos, their poetry reflected the lived sensation that nothing made sense anymore. That the modern age was wondrous, but also random, traumatic, nonsensical, and savage. Poets and artists like Ball, Marinetti, and Schwitters turned to sound poetry in the midst of war. Indeed, Schwitters became a refugee and had to flee Germany, ended up in Britain, ended up in an internment camp for illegal aliens. They were hard lives. You look at those images and think, who are these people doing silly things? But they lived and died for those silly things. And this kind of nonsense verse was born not only out of a political reaction, but also for for personal reasons too. And sometimes out of an unassuageable grief. For instance, the New York Dada poet and performer Baroness Elsa von Freydag-Lorenhoven, what a cool chick, wrote a poem called Klink-Hravenska, Death Wail. And this was published in 1920 to great controversy. But this was a nonsense verse that was written in response to her husband Leopold's suicide. She couldn't find the words to express her grief. The sound poem was a mourning song in nonsense sounds that transcended national boundaries. So that's a little mini art history lesson for you, and that was all a century ago. Why does it matter now? Why does it matter here? Why for me? So let me share my personal history. I won't overshare, I promise. And some aspects of the history of my island. that answers that question. So I want to begin way back, several thousand years ago when I was a little girl. The first language of Cyprus was an Etio-Cypriot spoken in the Iron Age and written in a Cypriot syllabary, a syllabic script that was derived from Linear A, which is a Cyprio-Minoan variant. And it came under pressure around the 10th century BC from Arcado-Cypriot Greek, and finally became extinct around the 4th century BC. And it's a language that is still as yet unknown and untranslated, except for a very small vocabulary attested in bilingual inscriptions. So such topics as the syntax, the possible inflection or agglutination remain a mystery. Though I think, this is just an artistic feeling, that the sound of that lost language persists in the way that Cypriots speak now. Kıbrıs'ı konuşmamızda hala var bu dil, with an accent that is ugly and uncongenial to both mainland Greek and Turkish speakers. The most famous Etio-Cypriot inscription is a bilingual text inscribed on a black marble slab found on the Acropolis of Amathus near modern Paphos in about 1912. And it's written in both the Attic dialect of ancient Greek and Etio-Cypriot. So it's rather wonderful that Etio-Cypriot was written from right to left like Arabic. So the Cypriot runs right to left and the Greek in left to right. And the syllables, so again, this is me making a nonsense poem out of those syllables. We don't really know how it was pronounced. Anamatore e, aml es a e, mugula e lasana, ariston ose, ardawanag, sogo os e. And the Greek script, forgive me, I'm not a Greek speaker, I polis I amathusion aristona, aristonactos, ef patridin. And all that means is the city of the Amathusans honored the noble Ariston, son of Aristonax. That's all we have left of our lost language. A lost heritage, a legacy that no longer makes sense. Add to this the fact that Turkish spoken by Turkish-speaking Cypriots is diglossic. That's to say, it has two versions, like, for instance, Arabic. We have a local variant that's markedly different from the high or formal educated form, which operates with local rules that don't make sense in canonical Turkish. So, for instance, we call it Lefkoşa, and educated Turks and say, surely it should be Lefköşe. And our Mausa becomes Magosa. So, more than that, this is an island also of many empires, and where the dominant language is Cypriot Greek. It's a polyglossic island where many languages and the ghosts of many languages operate. The ghosts of Venetian Italian, Lusignan French, English from the colonial days, Armenian from the refugees fleeing massacre, Arabic in the prayers that blare out of the mosques. Here at ARUCAD, you can hear Russian, Farsi, Italian, Spanish, French, as well as English and Turkish amongst our lecturers. When I go to my local market, I hear people speaking Uyghur Mandarin, Pashtun, Urdu. This makes for an environment where language frequently becomes both poetic and nonsensical. To take a biographical turn, I was born to an English mother and Turkish Cypriot father, and I was brought up bilingual. And my earliest years took place in Anamur, when the Turkish Cypriots here were enclaved, and they ran a radio station, Kıbrıs'ın Sesi. the voice of Cyprus, but actually from southern Turkey, from Anamur. And my father wrote and broadcast the English language news there. And so every night I listened to this Turkish-speaking man on the radio saying in his perfect BBC English, "Good evening, this is the voice of Cyprus." So I grew up thinking that the voice of Cyprus was my daddy, and the voice of Cyprus was bilingual. I was a greedy little girl, and I used to watch the muezzin climb up the stairs of the minaret. Those days it wasn't like a recording. It was a little guy who went up the stairs. And I used to I was waiting for lunch, and there he'd be, and I'd hear him, and I'd think, he's calling Allah, Buekmek. I was always changing words. When I returned to Cyprus, my beloved cousins mocked me for speaking in a mainland accent. But it's ironic, as now they speak much more properly than me. And I would watch English programs on Greek TV, dubbed into Greek, and so I'd sing along with Rupert the Bear and make it up in nonsense. Rupert the Bear, galiga gorigo, gigaliga ro. So nonsense is homely to me. Nonsense makes sense of ugly things. It makes more sense than war, borders, oppression. Nonsense is a kind of, it's a kind of love and connection in a world that insists on borders and change. When we reach the limits of the sayable, or when we're not allowed to say what we want to say, there's some way in which we can simply unsay it. And so, in order to celebrate this idea of nonsense, I'd like to read a poem that I wrote for you, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Men sabarin, alem galem mansura, diplava provada bokaronis, vilayet halen gayret minden öte, potin atlet komat drid, renç renç renç, çarpaç murat ise Skoda, BMW sayre sayre sayre. Vatan, 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 full kebab. Panaya Golokagatsky, Lenç babutsa, Margarina, Melano bulle. Hanyayı, Gonya'yı görmeden. Adle os bu eş eş eş, şalaguda pupu tik tik. Ah ah. Gavros kafedaki, çakistes, iplik. Menfaatsa mem çekirdekin, anafartalar, çakma, amur fatiler, gayrur memdulih menfaat müfredat. Sükrüm, çablıdaşım, dağlokum, canım, ciğerim, böbreğim. Nespresso, otaku hamachi, Gangelli gurbeten flauna, Gulama pikava korindenmiş. Ah, alem galem mansura, Hanya'yı, Gonya'yı görmeden